Good evening, everyone. Thanks very much for the invitation from College of Physicians. I'm a GP, so I sort of feel a little bit out of place here. So I stuck up my MRCPI qualification just to make myself feel more at home. But I'm here probably because I love food. I love talking about it. I love eating it. I love sharing it. But I suppose one thing with food, and it's probably different to other lifestyle methods, and then when we talk about lifestyle to improve health, food's something that isn't optional. You have to do it. You can do exercise, you could do meditation, you can do all these other things, but we have to eat. And when we eat, we make a huge choice, and that huge choice can determine our health and our environment. So I'm going to bring us through a little chat on basically, what is the environmental aspect? What is the healthy diet aspect? How do we combine these together? And then, because this is a talk for the public, I want to give you tips. How do we do this with patients? How do we do this with the general public in terms of what information can you bring away with yourself? So let's start with, what is a sustainable diet? This is hard. There isn't really a proper definition. You can get big, long, complex definitions from the UN. When we talk about sustainability, we talk about three areas. We talk about the social, the economic, and the environmental. In terms of the simplicity of tonight, I'm going to choose a sort of simpler definition, which is more that low environmental impact and healthy. Why are we talking about it? Because we've got a climate crisis. Okay, this is the scary slide, okay? This is food production is potentially going to be really difficult in a world with all sorts of climate change and storms and unpredictability in terms of heat. We're going to have 10 billion people by 2050 or towards the end of the century. So how are we going to feed them? The way our food system works determines the land use, the waste, the water. This is huge. And then health. We've got a health crisis. We've got obesity. We've got diabetes. All these are related to health. So what did we do? We got together, Climate Health Alliance, group of academics, policy people in terms of health, and we created the Fixing Food Together. So this was, how do we look at the whole of the food system, which is a big area, and then say, what are the areas we have to work on? And we narrowed it down to sort of 6 key areas. And some of these are very broad. And I've only got a few minutes, so I'm going to concentrate mainly on the first 2. Junk food and promoting transition to plant-based diet. We'll start first with the environmental situation, the environmental aspect. What's our current diet looking like? Okay, we talk about planetary boundaries. The planetary boundaries is how much of this is sustainable? How much can the planet cope with changes to the resource use we're having or the pollution we're having? We're on 226%. What that actually translates as, if everyone across the world eats like us, we need 2.25 planets to survive. We don't have 2.25 planets. So we've got a situation where we have to decrease our emissions. Where are emissions? Well, when I thought of this first, I always thought emissions is sort of something you see. That's the exhaust pipe coming out of cars, and it must be to do with transport and heat. Most people don't know that a quarter, maybe up to a third of emissions come from the food system. So the food system is creating a lot of these emissions. And what do these emissions do? They're released as global warming, so they hold on to heat and they change the climate of the planet. About half of those are due to either the land use or the crop use for livestock. So the way our food system works is determining the emissions. If we look at the individual foods and we say, what are the emissions related to these individual foods? There's quite a discrepancy. Okay, so just generally in terms of emissions, you'll see beef is far and away the biggest producer of emissions, much larger than the ones down the bottom. So the ones down the bottom would be sort of the plant the plant ones, and they'd be 10 to 50 times lower. So first message is certain foods have huge environmental effect in terms of emissions. Next slide's a little bit complicated, bear with me. Okay, the reason I'm showing you this is the brown bit is production, the green is land, and all the colours towards the end are transport, retail, packaging, processing. And the message I want to give you here is, if you want to reduce your carbon footprint, focus on what you eat, not where it comes from. In other words, the first most important thing of emissions is the food you choose. Local can be significant, but after the food choice. Why is that? We often think it's transport, but if you look at transport, you say, most of our food is transported by water and road, and they've very little carbon emission equivalents per kilometre than air freighted food. We do have air freighted food. So if you think Kenyan basil leaves, green beans, asparagus from Peru, berries from Canada, all those fresh produce that we want to have fresh, they come air freighted, huge carbon footprint. But then you've got foods that you say, well, I'd like an apple. And this week, if you go to the supermarket, you can choose Brazilian, Irish, New Zealand. So that's the same food source, the same food, but coming from totally different places. So that can determine what you're going to have. So seasonal is important, but seasonal, thinking local with seasonal. But environmental is a bit broader. It's not just about emissions, okay? So this is about biodiversity, the loss of biodiversity, because how we use our land, how we use our water, our soil, all this has an effect. And we can end up with a situation where we have to choose, how do we want to use our land? Do we want to grow forests and encourage wildlife? Or do we want to grow crops, or do we want to have livestock? Or how do we make sure it keeps regenerating itself? That's the environmental picture. What about food and health? Is there a connection? Well, if we look at the global burden of disease, which is the biggest study of risk factors for disease, you'll find that the majority of risk factors of food are related to health. Blood pressure, diabetes, heart attacks, all this is closely related to food. So food and health are linked. Which foods, though? If we look at death and we say, what is it about foods? So the global burden of disease study, again, it's older data. But if you look at the top 4, across the world, you could have 10 million lives saved. How? Well, they'd have to increase their fruit and vegetables, whole grains, nuts and seeds. If you look at the bottom 3, you could save 5 million lives. How? Well, processed meat, high salt, low fiber, that sounds like processed foods to me. Okay, so processed foods, especially ultra-processed foods, they tend to lose fiber, they're high in salt, can be high in fat. Probably the biggest issue with the Irish diet is processed foods, just in terms of health. Probably 50% of our calories are coming from ultra-processed food, 45% of our purchases. So this is the biggest win in terms of health, is processed foods. And it's a bit sad. If you looked at a third of people are having 2 unhealthy snacks, every day. 2/3 of people aren't really getting the minimum amount of fruit and veg. So we've got an issue with how the population is actually acting in terms of knowing how to eat better. And then you've got an interesting slide like this. This is from Darius Mozaffarian, who's the professor of medicine in Tufts University, one of the big nutrition universities in the US. And he did this in terms of cardiometabolic risk, the foods that would influence cardiometabolic risk. And cardiometabolic risk really means heart attacks and diabetes and obesity, the things that are the biggest issues for us today. And there's certain foods that are harmful, or certain nutrients, okay? And there's certain ones that are neutral. And then there's beneficial. And the thing I like about this slide is it tells us what is optimal. We always talk about average. oh, everyone should have a little bit better off the average diet. What about optimal? And optimal scares a lot of people, and we think we'll lose them if we tell them optimal. But we should know what's optimal. We should know what we're working towards. And the interesting thing, when you look at the top and you see the fruits and nuts and fish and vegetables, it sounds similar to the previous slides. The same sort of things we're missing. And then if you look down the bottom, you'll find the refined grains and the processed meats and sugars and starches. So all these foods that we know aren't good for us. At the moment, the Irish diet is probably 50% down the bottom, 30% in the middle, and 20% at the top. We have to move that. We have to change that. Once we know what's an optimal way of eating, we have to work towards that. So how do we combine this? How do we take the information that we know about health and diet and environment and diet, put them together and create an optimal eating plate? Well, the planetary diet was created by the Eat Lancet 2019. They studied over 2 years, 37 academics from across the world, 16 countries, and they came up with the best way that we could save 11 million deaths and feed 10 billion people sustainably by the year 2050. And they came up with this. And some of this looks familiar. Okay? Half your plate's fruit and veg. A little bit less than a quarter whole grains. Probably a little bit higher in terms of olive oil and rapeseed oil down the bottom. But the shocking bit, the scary bit was the protein. The protein, if you look at the section outside, they wanted increased nuts and legumes by at least 50% and a decrease in animal products by 50%. So this is scary because this is optimal. Optimal is scary for most of us. So how would we do this in Ireland? So as part of the Fixing Food, we looked at all the evidence and thought, what's suitable for us? And we decided, okay, number one, you're getting rid of processed foods or decreasing, minimizing the processed foods because that's a win-win. You're going to win in the environment, you're going to win on health. Red meat, we need to moderate. We need to decrease that. We need to decrease it from previous. Not necessarily stop, but decrease. Processed meats, minimize. There isn't really a health benefit, it's a harmful, and there's an environmental negative. And the dairy consumption was moderate. It was 3 portions a day, sort of fairly familiar with the usual, but unsweetened dairy products. But the other message was we need to diversify our protein intake. Okay, so we need to think about beans, peas, lentils. Can we get more of that into our diet? Increasing, making sure we're getting our 5 to 7 portions of veg that 2/3 of us aren't doing. Watching those freshly delivered ones that are air freighted. Fish twice a week. Tap water rather than our sugary drinks. Okay? How do we do this? The practical aspect. So the easy way to do this is swaps. Okay, so what does that mean? Well, if you get a breakfast cereal that's processed and it's, what do they call it? Cereal-flavored sugar in a way is what they call it instead of sugar-flavored cereal. So the first ingredient in a lot of these can be sugar. So that isn't got a nutritional benefit. We've got a white bread toast with jam. That sounds cool, but it is a refined grain and that jam is 50% sugar. So we could improve upon that. Oh, what about a fry? The Irish fry, you got processed meats. They're going to have environmental impacts. They're harmful. Why don't we raise our game? Why don't we turn that into a sustainable diet breakfast? We've got a whole grain oat. We got fruits, ideally seasonal and local. Nuts, seeds, we're trying to get protein sources in there. So that is a very simple thing. If that becomes your default breakfast, you can break it at the weekend, but that makes it sustainable. You'll keep it up if that's your default breakfast. So what about dinner? If we look at dinner, spaghetti bolognese. Okay, so spaghetti bolognese, what could we do? Let's get the bolognese, maybe half the mince. We could stick in lentils, we could stick in kidney beans. It's going to taste very similar. We've decreased the saturated fat, the cholesterol. We've increased the phytochemicals and the fiber. That's beneficial. We've decreased our carbon footprint. We could even decrease the amount of spaghetti. Okay, that's starchy spaghetti, and we could stick a side salad on the side, and we get a double win. Okay? So, in a way, you could nearly count people's fiber intake or plant intake to determine their healthy benefit. and it would have a knock-on effect in terms of the environment. And why is that? Well, plants have all sorts of benefits. And one of them is the phytochemicals. There's all sorts of phytochemicals. And they're usually found in the colour. We don't eat enough colour. And each colour has a different phytochemical. The more colours we get, the more beneficial chemicals and vitamins we get into our diet. So we should be eating each meal like a Picasso painting. It should look pretty. Should we look for variety of colours? The second thing that is a bit more modern is, what about diet diversity? We talk about diversity in terms of biodiversity in the planet and maximum species. What about inside ourselves? What about inside our gut? This is the microbiome, new area of research where it's just expanding really, really fast. And what they found in the American Gut Project, when they analysed 15,000 people's gut microbiome or bugs, what they found that if the association is the more diversity, the more health. And what they found is what led to more diversity was the amount of plants in your diet. If you can get 30 different plants into your diet per week, different fibres, each of them is a unique fibre, you will benefit the diversity, which will have a knock-on effect on health. How do you do that? It sounds like loads. You go back to your porridge and you're sticking in nuts and seeds and spices. You're thinking of your soup, your wrap, your curry, and you're just adding. What can I add that is a nutritional benefit? But overall, I want us to focus on the positive here. This is not about being vegan or vegetarian. This is about a slight shift. Okay, so this is about increasing the diversity of plants in your diet. Okay, so in summary, diet is hugely important. Okay, it's important in terms of health and sustainability. It's probably the most powerful thing you can do as an individual in terms of your individual carbon footprint, which you could decrease by 30% by having your meat, or even 60% if you decreased it even more. We know that we need to get rid of junk food and sweet drinks. We know there's simple swaps that are going to be beneficial, decreasing the meat, increasing the beans. The diversity in the colour is how we should be eating for our added health benefit. If we can eat seasonal, conscious of where the food comes from, and local, it'll also have an added benefit. But most of all, we have to lead by personal example. What you do has a ripple effect on others. Okay, you'll start asking for these things. The restaurants will respond. The supermarkets will respond. We need to start demanding this change because we don't potentially have very long. In that, if we think about it, it's going to be very hard to sustain any healthy populations on a sick and ailing planet. Thank you.